All right, back, ready to talk about Putin, populism, Russia, all that fun stuff. Yes, this is a Starbucks shirt I'm using as an impromptu pop filter. We're at a lower angle, shooting at night, all that fun stuff. Without further ado, transition. So, Putin's first year in office is relatively tame. He was just taken over after the much maligned Yeltsin. Didn't do too much. However, a year later in 2000, when he ran for re-election, he started really amping up that populist rhetoric and messaging throughout his run. He separated the Russian populace into two groups. There were the great workers, which we've seen and heard many a time, and there were the evil Russian oligarchs. He sort of railed against the Russian oligarchs many a time throughout his run. On top of this, Putin sort of went out of the way to present himself as an everyman. He talked with a distinct style of Russian accent, generally associated with the working class, with laborers, which is slower, a bit thicker in delivery, kind of hard to explain with an English accent. But he also did plenty of stunts, sort of, to accent his image. I'm sure most of us have seen images of Putin playing piano or, riding a bear or whatever. And this is sort of where he got his start doing things along those lines. And I mean, this whole shtick was relatively successful. During his first re-election, he won in an absolute landslide. And his first term was actually pretty good. He had widespread economic reform, anti-corruption measures, removing certain subsidies for oligarchs, as well as reinvesting in the Russian economy and increasing social safety nets. So just giving the Russian people a lot of things that they wanted and being generally helpful, which isn't what we consider Putin nowadays. So it should come as no surprise then that Putin won re-election in 2004 by a landslide. This guy was very well liked, his prospects were good, and he decimated whatever opposition there was. However, this is where things start getting a little dicey, not the most democratic processes here. Putin would then go on to nationalize the media, and for what media was nationalized, he'd sort of forge bonds or deals with the companies which already own them and kind of absorbed a lot of the free discourse, which we generally associate with a healthy democracy, freedom of speech, all that good stuff. On top of this, Putin also began publicizing a lot of private industries, which not necessarily a bad thing, but he was doing this very much in a way which allowed him to exert more direct control over the populace through a series of policies and whatnot. In fact, Putin absorbed so much of the political balance systems in Russia's kind of like shoddy democracy that they actually coined the term managed democracy or sovereign democracy to describe this. That's how much direct control the guy exerted over this whole deal. Now in 2008, we reach a point with term limits where Putin can't run again for president, so his right-hand man, Dmitry Medvedev, decides to run. With Putin's endorsement, this presidential candidate wins in a landslide, and Medvedev's first thing he does when he gets in office is appoints Putin as prime minister, as second in command, and Putin would more or less kind of run the government at Medvedev's side for the next 4 years. At this point, many Russians were kind of aware of how blatantly autocratic and how kind of anti-liberal democracy this whole thing was. And we begin to see a huge push in the resistance movement against Putin. There's the slogan, Russia without Putin, which gains a lot of traction, particularly among the younger Russians, amongst better educated Russians. This is also where figures like Alexei Navalny sort of get their start. Navalny being, I guess, the primary opposition leader in Russia, sort of gained an international following for a few reasons. It's actually at this time where sort of the populist framing rears its head once again. Putin begins dividing the country into his loyal patriots, which were generally the conservative, older Russians who supported him, and the, I kid you not, West-funded liberals. Putin begins using the term liberal as sort of a catch-all at this point to signal anything bad or which might oppose Russian sovereignty. It's kind of fuzzy, but that'll come up later. As a response to sort of the wide backlash of these protest movements and these opposition movements, Putin introduces the Don't Say Gay bill in 2014 and begins really cracking down on media. Sure, Russia had mostly controlled all things media related for the past 10 years or so, but here is when things start getting very, very strict and get severe punishments for expressing support of gay people or really any slightly dissent-fueled positions in media, which, not very cash or money. And suddenly, in 2014, Russia invades Crimea, which just so happens to be part of Ukraine. Now, they did this under the pretext that they were protecting themselves and the world from fascism, which definitely not true. And under the pretext that they were sort of defending against NATO expansionism, which I guess kind of has historical biases, but in this case, this was more or less Russia invading a sovereign nation for no good reason and saying, this is ours. We're really not supposed to do that in the 21st century. Yet they did. Now, surprisingly enough, this invasion actually increases Putin's popularity because the Kremlin-controlled airwaves were just feeding this constant stream of propaganda and pro-Putin, pro-Russia sentiment, depicting Ukrainians as basically subhuman and the clear villains here. Putin revs harder than ever before on the censorship, and we return to a level of suppression equal to the Soviet Union. Really not great stuff going on here for a democracy. This really begins to tax the Russian people, and they're just not that happy. The economy is stagnant. They very clearly live in an autocracy, and there's very little that they can do to inform their government. Of course, the 2020 election finally comes around, and Navalny's opposition party has a pretty serious edge, and legislature is passed that just bans any and all non-Putin candidates from running for president. Of course, Putin also extended his term limits here, so he could run again in 2016 and again in 2020. So, yeah, we've more or less descended into full dictatorship. It's not very good. So as a sort of aside, Russia began probably sometime in the mid-2010s waging a full-scale propaganda war on their citizens, on the rest of the world, the likes of which we had never seen before. Really unprecedented levels of unfiltered propaganda on a global scale. This is sort of like a machine gun approach, where what they'll often do is they'll just spread copious amounts of misinformation, none of which kind of seems true, but which makes it impossible to distinguish from what's false and what's actually happening. This strategy is incredibly effective, especially amongst the Russian older generation. Think boomers going on Facebook and suddenly talking about the Great Replacement or whatnot. It's that same thing. Older people just don't have the same level of media literacy, and it becomes really, really effective in sort of warping the populace. Russia even begins exporting this method of propaganda to the rest of the world. I know we all like to joke about Russiagate and Maddow and all that fun stuff, which didn't really matter in, 2017? I think that's when it was. Anywho, Russia really did spread quite a large amount of misinformation through either memes, through just blatantly false stories, through their state-funded media like Russia Today and other countries, and it not only supported regimes like Trump, but supported Le Pen, the far-right popular candidate in France, and even the German neo-Nazi party. Russia seems to just, or I guess Putin's Russia seems to just like to destabilize these other countries. And a way they do that is by supporting populist causes, and mostly right-wing populist causes. I guess to cap that off, this is what allows Russia to source these widespread campaigns of violence, which most people in the developed world you'd think would be against. So in December of 2021, Russia drops a security bill with a couple of security measures, which basically say Ukraine's a threat, they can't join NATO, blah, 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 blah. Almost immediately, people start getting nervous because this is more or less an outright declaration of war if Ukraine is to join NATO, something which they had at least considered strongly beforehand. And within a few months, in February of 2022, they begin the single largest ground invasion since World War II. Now, Russian civilians, for the most part, at least from the data we have right now, are mostly convinced that they are fighting Ukraine as a fascist country who wants to commit genocide on an unprecedented level, and also as a defense against liberal democracy in the West and encroaching power. What's even crazier is Russia's propaganda is so persuasive that even so many people in the West, so many Western leftists, sort of buy the Russia narrative hook, line, and sinker. It's crazy. I never thought I'd be listening to, I don't know, Chapo Trap House or Hassan Abi or Rising, or I guess it's called Breaking Points, and suddenly they'd just be giving little nuggets left and right to Russia based on disinformation spread by the Kremlin itself. It's just crazy. Now, that's not to condemn any of these people. I legitimately believe that they were acting in good faith for the most part. But it's kind of astounding that so many people just bought the narrative hook, line, and sinker. And honestly, this is pretty emblematic of just how persuasive and how powerful Russia's propaganda mechanism is. Because when you combine unprecedented levels of media outreach with a populist narrative, things start happening, man. It's important to note, Putin isn't new. We've seen so many populist leaders gain power and do the exact same thing he did, right? Think a lot of the failed Latin American autocratic regimes. Think Hitler. Think Trump. Now, obviously different degrees here, but when these leaders get into power using a democratic system, they then eat away at the democracy, so it directly benefits them and lets them control the system more. And Putin isn't unique. We've seen this happen many times. Even if Russia does have sort of a unique history which would open it up to a strong leader or someone very similar to Putin, it's still part of a broader pattern. And because of modern media and social media, really, we have the rare ability to spread brain disease across the world. Think of Donald Trump. Think of any far-right movement gaining traction in Europe, and suddenly, like a parasite, these hateful ideas spread across the globe. With Trump, we had this broad sort of meme culture fixated around him or someone like PewDiePie, which I don't know if it's directly involved. But suddenly you had people in Europe, people in Asia, people across the globe really feeling something in Trump's rhetoric or the memes that generated. I mean, let's face it, Putin was able to convince so much of the developed world that the invasion of Ukraine was justified. And if it wasn't justified, then, the fact that it was going to happen at all is just CIA propaganda or, mainstream media trying to be warmongers or whatnot, or just spread all these different levels of disinformation across the world in sort of a way which we're not really familiar with, or we really don't know how to combat yet. I guess the takeaway here for me is that we really need to be aware of the incredible threat that multifaceted propaganda techniques sort of pose in the modern world, especially when you combine them with really powerful populist rhetoric and utilizing technology in a way we haven't seen before. It's very, very easy to be sympathetic towards workers' causes or marginalized causes, but it's always important to look at exactly how and why this sort of stuff is being deployed. And, always check your sources. Thanks so much for watching. This was a doozy to edit and produce and write and all that stuff. But, it's fun. Glad I did it for school. It's important to learn about these sort of things, especially when they seemingly become more important every day. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your whatever time it is.